I will now move into the effect of demographic change on interest rates. Again, I start with a summary. In the past, I have already mentioned this at the beginning of this lesson. In the past, the effect of demographic change on interest rates has been very clear. The late 1970s and the 1980s, baby boomers were entering the labor market and have thereby contributed to increasing interest rates. Then in the 1990s and particularly the 2000s, baby boomer cohort has started to mature, has started to age, and this has contributed to decreasing interest rates. However, it is not very clear what to expect in the future. This is one of the big question marks in academic research right now, a very hot topic. At the bottom, you can see a short preview, what was happening on markets in the 1970s, 1980s, in the 90s to the 2010s, and what is happening today onward. I will explain these graphs more in detail very shortly. All of these little graphs I just showed you describe the loanable funds theory. The loanable funds theory was developed in the 1930s by economists Robertson and Olin, two pioneers in international economics. So this is a theory that is quite old, almost 100 years. And it is very simple. Loanable funds, the term loanable funds describes all forms of credits. So loans, bonds, savings, etc. And the idea is that the market interest rate is determined by the demand for loanable funds and the supply of loanable funds. So the interest rate is determined where the demand and supply of loanable funds are equal. Now, it is important to understand that when I talk about the interest rate, I always talk about the real interest rate. So inflation-adjusted interest rate. Now, to describe this loanable funds theory, I use a simple supply-demand diagram. On the y-axis, you can see the real interest rate. And on the x-axis, loanable funds. We have two lines. We have aggregate savings. If there's more savings, the interest rate increases. And we have the aggregate investment. So if there's more investment, the real interest rate decreases. At the intersection of these two lines is the equilibrium real interest rate. This is the baseline loanable funds theory. Now we can use this very basic chart to think about what happens when demography changes in a major way, such as, for example, the baby boom of the 1960s. This chart, you can see what happened in the late 70s to 80s with the real interest rate due to baby boomers entering the labor market. So in this period was when baby boomers started entering the labor market. But baby boomers were still young. So as we have seen in lesson 1, a young individual has a low propensity to save. They have a lot of investments into their own education, starting to found families. Generally, macroeconomically speaking, a decrease in aggregate savings. This is the dashed red line. So we move the aggregate savings curve to the left because there is a decrease in aggregate savings. At the same time, there was a massive growth of labor supply. Baby boomers entering the labor market. And this has led to a large economic growth because there was a lot of cheap labor suddenly available, cheap baby boomers. So the private sector started to invest a lot, started to grow a lot, started to invest a lot. So what we see is an increase in the aggregate investments curve. So the dashed blue line moving to the right. Now, after this happens, we look at a new intersection. So the intersection of the dashed blue line with the dashed red line. And we look what happens with the interest rate, and the interest rate increased. Both effects leads to increasing interest rates. So we should expect a higher interest rate. And now if we look back to the real world, what you see here is a chart of historical real interest rates in the G7 nations. And we are looking at this time period, so late 1970s to 1980s. And we see in all of the G7 countries a significant increase in real interest rates. So exactly what was predicted by theory. Now comes the 1990s, all the way up to today. So baby boomers are now starting to mature, starting to grow older. They start to save a little bit in the 1990s, and starting around the year 2000, baby boomers come into this age, in this saving age, where they start actively thinking about and preparing for retirement. So this age 50 to 64. So we see a big increase in aggregate savings. So the dashed blue line here moving to the right. This is even accelerated by China entering the global capital market. China has huge private savings, also because the retirement system is not very sustainable. This is well known by the population. So a lot of the Chinese populace saves for their own retirement. At this time, China really started entering the global capital market, dropping a lot of restriction for global capital movements. And this was observed already in 2005, famously by Ben Bernanke, who coined this term, the global savings glut, meaning already in 2005, there was too much savings on the market. So due to baby boomers growing older, due to China entering the capital market, capital stocks were growing too large. This was already known by Ben Bernanke in 2005, and it is still true, even more true today. At the same time, particularly starting around the time of the global financial crisis, 2008, we have been seeing a reduction in labor supply from baby boomers, first baby boomers starting to retire. And this has led to general reduction in investments by the private sector. This has also been observed since about 2008. The private sector has invested much less. Both of these effects leads to decreasing interest rates. Dashed red line moving to the left, dashed blue line moving to the right. So the new R, the new real interest rate, is much below the old equilibrium. demography has a negative effect on interest rates between 1990s to 2022. And if you go back to this chart of the interest rates in G7 nations, yes, no surprise. Since 1990, interest rates have decreased in the whole developed world, have reached negative values in many places of the world, and now starting to slowly increase again, but are still on a very, very low level. And now the big question mark, what will happen in the future? We have baby boomers retiring, stopping to save, even starting to dissave. So we should see a decline in aggregate savings or a move to the left of the AS curve. At the same time, labor supply also drops drastically as the majority of baby boomers start retiring. The private sector will drastically reduce investments just to maintain a stable capital labor ratio, because the labor will decrease so much, capital also has to decrease. So lower investments by firms. So also the AI curve, the aggregate investment curve, will shift to the left. Now, what happens if both of these lines shift to the left? What happens to the interest rate? Well, we don't know. Depends which one shifts more. Could stay the same, could increase, could decrease. Most large-scale economic models point towards persistently low interest rates. This is also part of a well-known hypothesis called the secular stagnation hypothesis, where GDP growth is slow, where interest rates are persistently low. It's a rather pessimistic outlook, but it is not clear. This is what most models point to, and I will argue a bit why these models might not be right. First, briefly, what we know. We know in the 1970s to the 1980s, demography, the entering of baby boomers on the labor market has led to an increase in interest rates. We know that since the 1990s, the retirement or the aging and later retirement of the baby boomers has led to decreasing interest rates. And we don't know what will happen in the future, because this saving should start at some point, but also retirement of baby boomers is continuing. Both effects might cancel each other out. There is a big question mark regarding China. China is quite interesting, as I have already mentioned, because of their really high private saving. And also because China is not really captured in any large-scale economic models, because economic models typically look at the developed world, and China typically does not count towards the developed world. So it is oftentimes neglected in these models. But there is a good argument to make that China's rapid aging may actually lead to a stronger decrease in aggregate desired savings on a global level than what is predicted by these large-scale models. So it might be that the AS curve shifts more to the left than what we think, what we calculate. And if this does happen, then the net effect on interest rates may actually turn positive, as is shown here in this graph. So if you just shift the AS curve more to the left, then we have a positive effect on interest rates. Then there's another very interesting argument to make, and that is the trend of automation, of robotization, artificial intelligence, however we may call it. This trend may actually lead to a shift in the desired capital labor ratio of firms. Firms might start replacing labor with capital, with machines, with robots, with AI. So firms might start investing more as a reaction of technological progress and as a reaction of labor shortages. Firms might actually not invest less, but invest more. This is also something that is not really well understood in economic models. It's a very, very open and hot topic right now in economic research. But if this does happen, if firms actually invest more, then we have a very clear positive effect of demographic change on interest rates. As you can see, this topic is not easy. There are very complex effects happening here and very many things to consider. I'll summarize again. The theoretical effect of demographic change on interest rates in the past has been unambiguous. So that there is a significant effect has been confirmed by many empirical papers. The direction of the effect is very clear. But the theoretical expectations for the future are less clear. Large-scale economic models commonly conclude that interest rates will remain persistently low. But none of these models account for China, and none of these models account for trends in robotization. These are big question marks that need to be solved to better understand what is happening in the future. Another big question mark is the role of increasing longevity. If we live longer, will this lead to more savings? Will this lead to a longer work life? Or will this lead to more transfers from the working age population to now longer living olds that were not prepared for such a long retirement? So also open questions in research on this topic. With this point, I close lesson number 2 of this 4th module. And thank you very much, and see you soon for lesson number 3.